Now, tomorrow, Scotland is removing most of its remaining coronavirus restrictions. Nightclubs will open, but secondary school children will still be expected to wear masks in the classroom. Scotland has been slower to ease COVID regulations, and until the 6th of January, you still had to self-isolate for the full 10 days if you were a close contact of someone with COVID. The leader of the SNP and the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, joins me now from Glasgow. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us. Has England removed its measures too quickly?
Look, that's a judgment the UK government has to take for England. It's not for me to second-guess that judgment. I'm responsible for, and indeed accountable for, the decisions we make around the handling of the pandemic here in Scotland. We have all along in Scotland opted to take what I would describe as a responsible and cautious path through this pandemic. Everybody wants to get back to normal. I desperately want the country to get back to full normality, but we have learned through bitter experience that this virus is unpredictable and we need to treat it with care, and that's what we are seeking to do. Tomorrow is a big step back to normality for us, and hopefully we'll be able to achieve that without seeing a resurgence of infection in the weeks to come.
And in Scotland, you've had much tighter restrictions. England just had Plan B measures. In Scotland, you've had much tighter restrictions. Yet, last week, 1 in 20 people in England had COVID and 1 in 20 people in Scotland had COVID. Were the restrictions worth it?
Yes, I think they were. I should say that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland were broadly in the same place and took broadly the same approach. England took a different approach, as it was entitled to do. If you look at the ONS survey, that 1 in 20 which you cited, in terms of the detail of that, around 5.5% of the population in England had the virus, or were estimated to have the virus in that week. It was around 4.5% in Scotland. So that is a difference, and overall, throughout this pandemic, levels of infection have been lower in Scotland. At times they've been higher, but overall they have been lower.
It's still 1 in 20 though, isn't it? It's not. I'm just asking you because obviously the restrictions have a big impact on people's lives. I'm just asking you whether they were worth it.
Of course. So that's the point I was going to come on and address, and the short answer to that is yes, I think they were, although yes, they have a big impact on businesses and individuals. What I was going to say is that while I understand the Scotland-England comparison, it's not, in my view, the most important one. The most important comparison is Scotland in a better position now than we were previously? And are we in a better position than we would have been without these restrictions? Now, it's always difficult in any country to absolutely prove cause and effect in the handling of a virus. But if you look at what we were predicting through our modelling, it would be the case in January before Christmas. What we were on track for, it was around 50,000 infections a day, and we didn't see that materialise or anything like that materialise. And I think that was a combination of the acceleration of the booster campaign. Scotland is the most vaccinated part of the UK in terms of first, second, third and booster doses. These sensible, balanced protective measures we introduced before Christmas, and lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the magnificent responsible response of the public, who changed their behaviour in the face of Omicron in order to try to stem transmission. So yes, I think what we did has been worth it, and we are hopefully now seeing Scotland, as other parts of the UK, very firmly on the downward slope of that Omicron wave.
The head of UK hospitality in Scotland said that the restrictions coupled with health messaging over Christmas and Hogmanay were incredibly damaging for businesses already carrying unsustainable levels of debt. Did those restrictions make enough of a difference to justify that?
Yes, I think they did, but that's not me saying I don't understand and agree that those measures had a very adverse effect on businesses, and hospitality right throughout the pandemic has been one of the worst hit sectors for reasons I think everybody understands. But I think we've got to, and I know how hard it is for people in business to accept what I'm about to say, but it's not a case of having protective measures and businesses are damaged, or having no protective measures and everything is fine. It is the difference between having protective measures that stem transmission, which I think these did, or allowing transmission to go completely uncontrolled, in which case the impact on business is even greater and even more damaging.
Did the
Living with this pandemic for any country is not perfect, but that's an understatement. But we have to navigate our way through it as sensibly and as cautiously and as carefully as we can, and that's what we will continue to do.
Do the vaccine passports that you're keeping in place, do they actually work in terms of reducing transmission?
Well, again, I will inject, in the interest of frankness, my caveat from earlier on. It is very difficult when you're dealing with an infectious virus to be 100% certain about measure A leading to effect B. But yes, I do think they help us as a package of measures protect against transmission. So what they do is ensure that in some of the highest risk settings, if the majority of people are vaccinated, and that doesn't eradicate the chances of an outbreak, but it reduces the chances of an outbreak in these settings. And secondly, and really importantly, because we know the biggest power of the vaccines is in reducing serious illness and death, if you then do have an outbreak in one of these higher risk settings, then you are reducing the number of people, if they are vaccinated, who are likely to become very seriously ill. And that also then reduces the pressure that such an outbreak might then have on our National Health Service.
So the evidence from
looking at any single measure alone doesn't tell you that it is entirely responsible for containing the virus. It's a package of measures. And of course, if you look across Europe right now, many countries have COVID certification schemes in place, and many countries have them in place in a much wider spread of venues than is the case here in Scotland. And of course, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have all chosen to do this. And we talk about, often when we're in Scotland, and I'm sure it feels the same in Wales and Northern Ireland, we feel as if we are being described as somehow doing things unique, and because England hasn't done them, we're the outlier. And I'm saying this not pejoratively, just as a statement of fact. In many of these cases, it's actually England that's the outlier, not just in a UK context, but in a European context. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are actually following the path that many European countries are also taking.
I'm just talking about vaccine passports, though, because one of those, the impact that those has had, they have had, Gavin Stevenson from the Nighttime Industries Association says that they've had devastating consequences for a substantial proportion of businesses. And your government's own evidence on the scheme says it doesn't say it reduces transmission, says there was only a very slight increase in vaccine uptake because of them.
Well, look, Scotland right now is the most vaccinated part of the UK. Our vaccine rates are higher than all of the other 3 UK nations, although all are high in terms of first, second, third and booster doses. So, you know, we've had real success in that. I don't underplay the impact of any of these measures on businesses, but if you take nightclubs, the nighttime industry, checking people's COVID certification, I think, is a better alternative to these places being closed. It means that they're open as of tomorrow and trading again. And nightclubs, it's a long time since I was in a nightclub, Sophie, but you know, checks for different things that are not unheard of. We have big sporting events which have been able to have spectators in again for the last number of days, checking COVID passes, and that is not causing anybody any real hardship, and many of the concerns and fears we had about...
The Scottish Government's evidence itself says business organisations have reported negative economic consequences in terms of footfall and revenues, along with staffing difficulties because of them. Are you going to bring COVID passports to an end or not?
Well, eventually, yes, I hope. But
when's eventually?
More than hope. Of course they will come to... Well, look, Sophie, I'm not going to sit here and tell you a date for that, because I would literally be making it up, because we're in the throes of a global pandemic that is still unpredictable. Now, you talk about economic consequences, and yes, there are economic consequences for everything that we do to try to control the virus. But the point I made earlier is the point I'm going to make again, because it's really important. There would also be big economic consequences if we didn't try to control this virus in any way, if we just let it spread in an uncontrolled way. That's the really hard fact at the heart of this. You can't escape economic consequences when you're in a global pandemic. The question is, how do you manage all of this in the least damaging and the least harmful way? We have an analysis that we apply to everything we do in the Scottish Government around what we call 4 harms. We look at the direct harm from COVID, the associated health harms and the economic and social harms. And what we try to do is come to balanced decisions that lead us to the least possible damage and harm. But the idea, and I know after 2 years why people want to believe this, but the idea that we can navigate our way through a pandemic like this with no impact at all, unfortunately, is not the case.
What about
if we
masks?
let this virus spread, it would be more deaths, more illness, and also more damage to the economy. One of the biggest challenges with Omicron, of course, has been staff absences caused by infections. Now, if we had taken no measures to control this, that would have been even worse, and therefore businesses would have found it even more difficult to continue to trade.
What about masks in public places? Because they are staying in place for now. How long do you think that will be? Can you envisage people having to wear masks in public places for months or years to come?
Look, I hope not. I don't want any of these measures to be in place for any longer than is necessary. But masks, and there is very good international evidence on this. Masks are something we can do. None of us enjoy wearing them, but they are perhaps not the biggest handicap to endure in order to try to stem transmission. So while they can make a difference to controlling the virus, then I think it is something that we should do. And again, I would suggest that it is England that is the outlier here, not Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, or many countries across the world. Can I just say one other thing here? Nobody likes these measures, but an opinion poll, and I accept that opinion polls are just that, but an opinion poll in Scotland on Friday showed that 2/3 of people in Scotland thought that we had taken the right approach in these balanced measures. People don't want to be living in a pandemic, but people understand that in order to protect ourselves, to protect each other, to protect our society as a whole, and show that solidarity that has served us very well here in Scotland, doing things like wearing face coverings is perhaps a small price to pay to keep other people safe, and also to allow the most clinically vulnerable to continue to live something like a normal life.
You said last week that Scotland, you hoped, was turning a corner on Omicron. You promised that once Scotland came out of the COVID crisis, you would table the legislation for a referendum on independence. When are you going to do that?
The preparatory work of that is underway right now. We haven't decided on the date that we would seek to introduce the bill. We will decide that in the coming weeks. But what I have said, and I will happily say again to you right now, that my intention is to take the steps that will facilitate a referendum happening before the end of 2023. That's the proposition that just short of a year ago I fought an election on and was re-elected as First Minister. My party was re-elected with a historically high share of the vote. This is about democracy. It's about allowing the people of Scotland to choose our own future. And for goodness sake, when we look at everything that has been happening over years now in Westminster, the chaos, the instability, the unpredictability, then I think there are a growing number of people in Scotland who think actually we could do much better as an independent country in charge of our own fate rather than having people like Boris Johnson.
People also want to know when you are going to table this legislation. And in 2017, you said autumn 2018 was the common sense time for another referendum. In autumn 18, you said you'd set out your plans for an independence referendum in the not too distant future. In autumn 2019, you said the referendum must happen next year. In autumn 2020, you said you wouldn't rule out a vote in 2021. And in 2021, you said you'd start pushing for a referendum in spring 2022. When is going to be the right time?
Look, I make no apology for the fact that over the past 2 years as First Minister, I have prioritised steering the country through a pandemic. At the outset of the pandemic, I very clearly said we were putting plans for an independence referendum on hold. If only Boris Johnson had done likewise with plans around Brexit, we wouldn't be seeing some of the chaos associated with Brexit right now. But I am determined, I've won an election on this basis, to give people in Scotland the choice over our future. And I believe when that choice comes, people will choose an independent future. The preparatory work for that is underway and will determine the precise date for introducing that legislation in due course. We are hopefully, as I said earlier on the downward slope of this wave of Omicron, which clears the way for us to do that. The key thing is that we will take these steps in a timescale that will facilitate that referendum before the end of 2023, which is the commitment I made at the election and was elected on overwhelmingly.
Given that Boris Johnson's approval ratings are at rock bottom right now and support for Scottish independence is still only around 50%. If that doesn't drive support for independence, what will?
Look, Sophie, I'm laughing not at the question. I'm just laughing at reflecting the fact that if you told me when I was a much younger politician that one day 50% support for independence would be seen as some kind of failure, I would have grabbed that with both hands. Look, support for independence, I believe, is rising. I think when Scotland comes to choose, we will choose independence, not just because of the current occupant in number 10, but what that is illustrating very powerfully is the fact that Scotland too often ends up with things imposed upon us, Brexit, for example, or being governed by people and by parties that we don't choose. And all of that is the price of not being independent. Being independent is not some magic wand that takes away all challenges that we will face, but it puts our destiny, our fate, our future in our own hands.
Well, we'll have to talk about that.
That's the beauty and the essence of independence, and I believe that's what people in Scotland will choose when they get the opportunity.
Plenty more to discuss. I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk that another time. But for now, thank you very much, Nicola Sturgeon.